Good afternoon and welcome to the Society for the Rule of Law's webinar on domestic deployment of the military. My name is Gregg Nunziata and I am the Executive Director of the Society for the Rule of Law. Before we start our program, I just wanted to give you some updates on who we are if you're not familiar with us and what we've been up to lately. The Society for the Rule of Law is an organization of conservative, center-right, and libertarian lawyers who are devoted to the defense of the rule of law, the Constitution, and American democracy above our partisan or policy preferences. We are a membership organization, and the support of our members make our programming possible. So if you're not already a member, please consider becoming one. We will have a link in the chat where you can do that. Membership is at various levels and you don't need to be a lawyer to join. If you are a member, thank you, and consider inviting friends. We do a lot of things at the Society. Most of what we do are events like this, where we try to heighten the level of discourse around key rule of law issues. And that is certainly something we'll be doing today. We also engage in some targeted advocacy through our sister organization, the Society for the Rule of Law Institute. A bunch of updates on what we've done since our last webinar a couple of weeks ago. I just yesterday, on behalf of the Society for the Rule of Law Institute, wrote a letter to the Senate Judiciary Committee opposing the nomination of Emile Beauvais to the Third Circuit. We'll have a link for that in the discussion. We partnered with several other groups to oppose language in the House and Senate in the reconciliation bill that would have made it more difficult for plaintiffs to challenge government actions. We have a number of original articles, and our members were published in a bunch of national publications in the last couple of weeks. We will have links to all that there too. We are hiring, which is a big announcement. We're hiring for a new year-long fellowship for young lawyer here in Washington, D.C. The job description will be in the chat. Please share with anyone who might be interested. And our next event will be an in-person summer networking event at Lincoln Restaurant in Washington, D.C. on July 16th. If you're in the area, I hope you can join us that evening. With that, I would like to move to an introduction of our very impressive panel. We have with us today three experts on this question. The first is Professor Claire Finkelstein. She's the founder and faculty director of the Center for Ethics and the Rule of Law, which is affiliated with the University of Pennsylvania's Annenberg Public Policy Center. She's a senior fellow at the Foreign Policy Research Institute and has written a great deal on this issue. A couple of her recent articles will be linked to in the chat, including Protecting the Integrity of the National Guard, which I found for myself to be a really helpful orientation to the laws at stake here. Next, we'll hear from Kevin Carroll. Kevin is a partner and attorney at Fluet law firm, a firm that focuses on national security. He served for 30 years in the U.S. Army, including tours in Iraq and Afghanistan, and has served in other national security and public service roles as well, including as senior counsel to then Homeland Security Secretary John Kelly during the first Trump administration. Finally, we'll hear from Garri Hendell, Lieutenant Colonel in the Pennsylvania Army National Guard. He has served 3 overseas deployments to CENTCOM, as well as various training deployments across Europe, and he served as the Brigade Task Force S3 responsible for land forces in support of operations on the U.S.-Mexico border in 2022. Garri recently wrote an article for the Society's website called Where is the Line, which we will also link to in the chat. And with that, I would like to turn it over to our wonderful panel to give us some opening thoughts. First, Claire, please.
Thanks so much, Greg, and it's wonderful to be with you on such an important webinar, really critical topic. So,
Have we lost Claire?
I think we may have.
Okay. Well, if she perhaps we will try to reconnect with Claire. Perhaps we could start with Kevin, and he can share his thoughts, and I'm sure Claire will understand.
Sure thing.
Okay.
Hey, everybody. And Greg, thanks very much for putting this together and having me on. I guess I held a couple of assignments that are relevant to this. As a reservist, I was in the Office of the Secretary of Defense Policy Shop in the Homeland Defense Office, which managed interactions between the military and civil affairs. And then I worked for John Kelly at the outset of the Trump administration. I think the professor will probably go through some of the statutory considerations here regarding Posse Comitatus and the Insurrection Act. So what I plan to do is outline 5 worries I have about the next few years and the domestic use of the military. First is how the well-established use of the National Guard and even federal forces to put down civil unrest could spin out of control under poor leadership. 2, about the very bad idea of using the military, the National Guard specifically, in internal immigration enforcement. 3, the way some counterterrorism responsibilities of the military could become problematic in the current environment. How some counter-narcotics responsibilities in the military could become problematic in the current environment. And finally, the big enchilada, which is 2028, and whether there's an attempt to misuse the military in the resolution of the 2028 election. Civil unrest. There's a very long tradition of using National Guard and even federal forces when there's pursuant to an invocation of the Insurrection Act by the president, when there's an inability to exercise federal law in a jurisdiction. This was done most recently in 1992 during the LA riots, when 62 people were killed after police who assaulted Rodney King were acquitted. Even under the best of circumstances, this is fraught with risk. There's a famous story from LA in '92 when they partnered up some Marines and some LAPD guys to do a patrol. And some LAPD guys said to the Marines, "Hey, cover me," as they ran into a building. Meaning have your weapons ready is the way a cop would mean it. And the Marines opened fire with rifle fire and grenade fire on the building. It means different things to different people. So even under good leadership, as we had back then, it's really problematic. Why I'm worried is in 2020, Trump sought to use the 82nd Airborne to help put down the George Floyd demonstrations in D.C. The plan was for them to air assault into D.C., for goodness sakes, and to have their uniform basic load and bayonets with them. That was shut down by junior officers who said that they wouldn't do it. And Secretary of Defense Esper recommended against invoking the Insurrection Act. So in a second term, not constrained perhaps by facing re-election, I worried that could go bad. Internal immigration enforcement. Since the very first week of the first Trump administration, Stephen Miller has wanted to invoke what's called Section 287G of the Immigration Nationality Act to allow the National Guard to do internal immigration enforcement. It's a terrible idea. National Guard infantry units may have some civil unrest training in how to break up a crowd. Nobody except military police, criminal investigators in the military has law enforcement training, and the Fourth Amendment, Fifth Amendment, Sixth Amendment. So it's just inevitable that there would be civil rights violations against Hispanics who are being asked to prove that they are lawfully in this country, and then there would be legal action, presumably either civilly in the federal courts or criminally in state courts by local prosecutors against how these untrained 18-year-olds with rifles are being asked to do something that's really the job for experienced 1811, as they're called, federal criminal investigators. The counterterrorism mission of the military, as it involves nuclear weapons, is freshly relevant. As we know, we just entered into a war with Iran the other day. There's about 80 pounds of highly enriched uranium on the move somewhere that we don't know. And if there's a render safe mission, a nuclear render safe mission, it's the responsibility of the military's Joint Special Operations Command to take care of that. That actually has happened in the U.S. before. It's not well known, but there was a really credible report of a nuclear weapon in New York Harbor on the night of September 10th to 11th, 2002. And SEAL Team 6 and their explosive ordnance disposal guys were involved in taking that down. So we currently face a real threat of Lebanese Hezbollah or the Quds Force conducting some sort of terrorist operation in the United States. So you could have JSOC pulled into that. And again, they're the finest professionals we have in the current environment under a Secretary of Defense who does not have the experience and the judgment, in my view, for his job. I'm worried about the deployment of active duty special operators. And again, this has happened before. I mean, they were deployed to Boston in 2013 after the Marathon bombing, when it was thought that there were just not enough civilian law enforcement possibly to deal with taking down that cell. Just briefly, counter narcotics. This has bit the military in the rear before. There was a ill-conceived operation called Joint Task Force 6 back in the 1990s, where active duty forces, including Marines, were put on the border to look out for drug traffickers. Again, the military doesn't have law enforcement training. What predictably and tragically happened was that a Marine ended up shooting and killing a teenaged shepherd boy who was carrying a .22 rifle, literally to protect his flock from wolves. And just as predictably, the local district attorney charged the Marine with murder, and he was eventually acquitted, or maybe the charge was dismissed. But you had a situation where a youngster was put into a situation for which he hadn't received training, and that's just not fair. And finally, as I said, the really big concern is 2028. We know, thanks to the work of the January 6th Commission, and then the Jack Smith Special Prosecutor's Office and the indictment that they eventually issued, that the plan by Attorney General Freudian slip there, Assistant Attorney General Clark, who was supposed to become the Attorney General, and John Eastman, who was sort of the intellectual godfather or anti-intellectual godfather of the idea that Vice President Pence could throw out the election results. They anticipated violent riots in American cities and blue cities and states if that had come to pass, and using the Insurrection Act and federal troops to put down the unrest that understandably would have happened. We had, for that reason at that time, a letter co-signed by every single former Secretary of Defense, which is remarkable when you think about it, stating that the military had no role in resolving the 2020 election. And after the election was certified, all of the members of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, every Joint Chief, every service commander, put their signature on a letter saying that the election had been resolved. So again, that dangerous situation unfolded even with some responsible leaders, such as Mark Esper around. And so I'm worried what might transpire if there's a contested election in 2028. You have individuals of the character of J.D. Vance presiding over the Senate, and Pete Hegseth in charge of the Pentagon. Over.
Thank you, Kevin, for sobering thoughts, and I'm sure we'll come back to many of those points. Claire, welcome back. I'm sorry that you had the difficulty connecting, but we'll go to you now.
My apologies for the connectivity problems. And thanks so much, Kevin, for your excellent remarks, and I'll actually be picking up on a few of them. But so I was going to give a little bit of an overview of where we are with the California situation, and then try to give a bit of a sense of what's happening in the rest of the country, in particular picking up on Kevin's remarks about the 287G program, because I think that program is of very grave concern. So as every year in California, there are about 4,000 federalized California National Guard troops, and then there are about 2,000 Marines that have been deployed. They are a little bit handcuffed in that they are operating under posse comitatus, and we'll talk in just a minute about what the limits of posse comitatus are and what posse comitatus. It's important to know that with all of these troops that have been deployed, only a very small percentage of them are actually active in the streets. Most of them are just being kept in reserve and haven't been doing all that much. There's been a legal battle over whether or not the president has the right to federalize these troops and whether or not he has the right to deploy the Marines under these circumstances. So to give a little bit of background to why that's an issue, it's important to be aware that under the 10th Amendment, of course, the governors and local officials have the right to control law enforcement matters. And normally when you think about a protest and a protest getting out of hand, the police of the local jurisdiction are the ones that would handle that. And a typical situation, for example, in the famous Rodney King riots in Los Angeles in 1993, if the governor feels that mayor feels that he or she cannot handle the situation, there would be a request to the federal government to say, hey, we cannot handle this. We would like National Guard, or the governor can just deploy the National Guard. The National Guard are, of course, under the control of the governor in what's called state active duty status. When you're talking about a hurricane or a major statewide event, the governor may deploy the troops under Title 32 status, declaring an emergency. And then the third way that National Guard troops can be deployed is under Title 10, and that would be federalized status. And that's what's happened here. The more frequent way in the past that troops have been deployed under Title 10, when the president chooses to federalize the National Guard, is under the Insurrection Act. And Kevin is most notably not what happened here, because the president chose to federalize the California National Guard under 10 U.S.C. 12406, which is a more rarely used statute. It's only been used actually 2 other times in our history. Most notably, the last time was when President Nixon decided to federalize New York National Guard in order to make sure that the mail kept getting delivered during a postal strike. But what most commentators seem to believe is that 12406 is not an exception to posse comitatus the way that the Insurrection Act is. And what that means is that federalized troops are not allowed to engage in law enforcement activities. So they are not allowed to supplement the LAPD with regard to making arrests. They are not allowed to detain. Technically, they shouldn't be allowed to do that. They shouldn't be allowed to have any involvement in the ICE raids or deportations or anything of the sort, because all of that would be considered law enforcement. Now, what's a little bit tricky and maybe gray area is with regard to the Marines. So the Marines are under deployment orders, rules for the use of force, or an RUF, that allows them to detain but not arrest, trying to thread that needle very carefully. The deployment authority for sending out the Marines is not 12406, but is what's called the protective power, which is the president has the right to deploy federal troops to protect federal assets, federal buildings, federal law enforcement officers, and in this case, it was ICE and Customs and Border Patrol agents who were trying to conduct arrests and deportations. And the argument is, look, we have agitators and protesters who are getting in the way of our conducting this operation. It is a lawful operation, they claim, and therefore we are entitled to bring out federal troops in order to, under the protective power, which is an implied power, in order to make sure that these federal law enforcement agents can go ahead and do their job. Now, in general, posse comitatus, which is the principle that it's both a principle and a federal statute, but it's the principle that separates military operations from law enforcement, and says that military operations and law enforcement should not commingle, that the military should not be deployed for law enforcement purposes, with a couple of very rare exceptions, such as during hurricanes, when there is under Title 32, for example, or state active duty status, when the governor is deploying troops, there is unrest during a statewide emergency. But normally, when troops are federalized, they are governed by posse comitatus, and they are not allowed to engage in law enforcement activities. Now, question, right? Something that you might have heard discussed, that a lot of people are discussing, is when the Marines, for example, are deployed under the protective power, are they constrained by posse comitatus? And the answer to that should be yes. The reason for that is that posse comitatus requires an express exception exception. And what we have with the protective power is an implied power, and there's no express exception to posse comitatus that is part of that invocation of federal authority. So therefore, both the Marines and the National Guard should be bound by posse comitatus. So what does that mean? Well, the Marines who have been told that they can detain but not arrest, and that happened with a veteran who was trying to make his way into the Veterans Affairs office, was detained for roughly 2 hours by the Marines. He had his hands zip tied behind his back, and the instructions that are under to wait for a law enforcement officer to come along and make the arrest. In my view, and the view of some others with whom I've spoken, that would be that action was a violation of posse comitatus, because being detained is a law enforcement activity. Now, the Pentagon, Northcom, has obviously tried to thread the needle here and has said in their rules for the use of force that such detentions are lawful. My view is that's a mistake. In the legal briefs that have been flying back and forth, and I'm happy to detail for you where we are in that litigation, and we're in the process of actually, my organization, the Center for Ethics and the Rule of Law, is in the process of actually supporting that litigation in various ways. But so in the interest of full disclosure, but the government has filed its brief in the Ninth Circuit, which upheld its authority. But in that brief, they said, we did not violate posse comitatus, and in any event, posse comitatus does not apply. So there is an argument there to be had about whether or not posse comitatus applies and whether or not 12406 is in fact an exception. But my very strong view is that that 12406 is not an exception to the posse comitatus rule. And I just want to mention one more thing here, which is that everybody seems to think that it's clear that the Insurrection Act is an exception to posse comitatus. I have a slightly different view of that. My view is that while it is an exception, the concept of posse comitatus is not an on-off switch, but that it's a scalar notion. So that while if the president does federalize National Guard under the Insurrection Act, he is only allowed to have federalized troops engage in law enforcement activities to the extent necessary to carry out the authorization under the Insurrection Act. But it's not as though by invoking the Insurrection Act, suddenly all bets are off and posse comitatus doesn't apply across the board. To echo some of what Kevin said earlier, this squares very much with the military that I work with, and I talk to both retired and active duty, who say, we are not trained in law enforcement activities. This is not our beat. This is not what we're here for. We are needed for high priority national security deployments. Obviously, the U.S. is involved in a number of highly sensitive military operations or hotspots around the world. This is what they train for. They do not train to deploy to California and turn their forces to our own citizens. And I think that the military that I'm familiar with are deeply uncomfortable with these kinds of deployments. I think that they should be the rare exception to how we use our forces. And I think that's what the posse comitatus rule contemplates. So I think it's a deep concern what's going on right now in California. Very briefly, a word about 287G, and then I'll stop talking, which is in predominantly Republican-led states, the federal government has entered into a number of agreements to lend the services of the National Guard so that those guardsmen can stay in state active duty status. And then in, for example, Texas or in Florida, under 287G, the governor and the adjutant general of those states and some other states would lend their National Guard for immigration purposes. One thing that's very concerning about that is that the National Guard would be under the authority of Customs and Border Patrol. So they would be designated, they are in those states, in case they are needed, designated as law enforcement officers who operate under the command of Customs and Border Patrol and ICE. And it's a kind of reversal of the chain of command. They would not be responsive to their own chain of command, but they would be responsive to Customs and Border Patrol to assist them with those immigration raids and deportations. These agreements have been widespread across the country, and indeed in some states, like my state of Pennsylvania, it has happened that a number of the counties have entered into their own agreements without permission of the governor, which is allowed under state law, as Pennsylvania law currently stands, with the result that we have a divided state. And, you know, they call Pennsylvania Pennsyltucky because it's sort of Pennsylvania with Kentucky in the middle. We have a bunch of counties that have gone off on their own, and I doubt that that's something that the governor is very happy about. Some states, like the state of Washington, have passed legislation to protect the authority of the governor over their own National Guard against some other dangers, such as the risk of other states' National Guard coming into the state and the governor losing control over National Guard operations within the state. So there are a whole bunch of issues that can happen around the 287G and federalization that play out with regard to national politics and whether you're a red state or a blue state and you're willing to play ball with the immigration operations or not, and be glad to continue that discussion during the Q&A.
Great, thank you, Claire. And, I don't know if you can video, but we lost your video. If you could join us, that would be great. Now.
Great. Thank you so much there. Thanks for being here. It's nice to be in the august company of Professor Finkelstein and you know, Mr. Carroll with their government and academic background. I'm a National Guard guy, which means I'm in a couple worlds at once. I'm going to talk a little bit about my background, not because I'm self-important about it, but I need to make a disclaimer that I'm not here on behalf of the Department of Defense or on behalf of my civilian employer, who's the city of Chicago. That's because I work in police oversight on the civilian side, so dealing with Fourth Amendment issues mostly, and a former civilian DOD employee at National Guard Bureau. I was a branch chief, so very familiar with kind of our mobilization authorities and how we use the Guard domestically and overseas. Gregg was kind enough to mention my overseas deployments and my time at the border, where a lot of these issues came up. If you think about the way Texas uses its Guard and some of the other states, the bluer states use their Guard. What I want to do, I was also a litigator for 12 years, so a little bit of legal background, even though that's not my military job. I just want to do a slightly different take on the PCA, just based on kind of the history. I wrote a piece back during President Obama's inauguration where the Maryland Guard was deployed in to support the inauguration, and so there was some PCA violations there in my view, and we kind of aired that issue with Guard Bureau and some of the DC Guard folks. So you know, quickly, kind of my take on it is really goes back to the point of the executive power and our separation of powers regime. Sets policy for the nation, and the executive is really the branch that is designed to act when the legislature does not have time to act. So when there is an emergency, that is the time for executive action or executive instruments. So when I did my PCA analysis back in the day, and again, I'll defer to Claire's expertise, but I'll give you my view anyway, is that the PCA was not designed to constrain executive action, right? The PCA was designed to restrain the use of troops by other actors in the post-Civil War South, basically to stop the local constable from going to the garrison and bringing a platoon out to enforce the 13th and 14th Amendments. And so you get to a place very quickly where the the analysis, the legal analysis, gets us to the president can use the military however the president needs to enforce the laws of the United States. And if you look at the provision that the Ninth Circuit relied on, and I called out in my article 11 years ago, 10 U.S.C. 12406 sub 3, right? There's really a plenary authority to use the military forces of the United States to enforce the laws if we need to. And so I would never look at PCA as something that restricts the executive, right? If I was more of an inside the beltway person, I might say when I agree with the administration, they should be allowed to use it, and when I don't agree, they should be restricted. However, the legals, in my view, are pretty clear, simply because we have a long history of that. So my old unit in Philadelphia, the first troop was brought out as strike breakers by General Washington. There's some great dicta in the Supreme Court that talks about the full force of the nation can be applied to enforce the laws when necessary. I think the problem we get to is that the Constitution envisages this executive, the head of the executive branch, as this emergency responsible person. So the legislature cannot act. And so we have this George Washington-like character of impeccable judgment who then decides how we're going to do these things, which culturally we don't wish to do, which is use military force in domestic enforcement, right? But if we need to, like we do all the time, right? So there's the counter-drug program at Guard Bureau, there's the use of the forces at the border, and we could be very picayune about what military can includes the power to detain, right? Any significant use of military force domestically is going to include some type of police power, and it's kind of inherent in that use. The system that we have, though, operates that the elected leader is kind of a good faith guardian of the Constitution, and that's why the executive has all these powers. And the challenge that I think we are faced with collectively now is, what if someone is not a good faith guardian of the Constitution? And if we look at the current administration and specifically, and as a New Yorker, we can talk about Mr. Trump pre-politics, his litigation posture, very much was a bad faith litigant or someone who abused the process of the courts as a private citizen. And I think what we're seeing now is the Department of Justice kind of employing some of those same tactics, this kind of bad faith use of courts and not entirely straightforward with the court when the attorney appears before the court. And the challenge is, that gets to the deference that we, the judiciary, traditionally pays to the executive branch. So if the executive branch says it's an insurrection, the judiciary typically says, look, it's not our place to judge. The point of the executive is to make these decisions under duress. We're the Monday morning quarterback guys. Congress gave them the power a long time ago. I'm not going to intervene. And I think we're getting to a place where that traditional deference is running into the facts, where we can call Los Angeles an insurrection. We can say the words, and the courts habitually defer to the executive. And we're just, I think legally, it's not, in my respectful view, and again, I defer to Claire and Kevin and the people who are smarter about this, but it's not is there a legal authority, and is the use of the guard outside legal authority? It's like, well, now we have to look behind the executive's declaration of the conditions precedent, and instead of simply deferring to them, to say, well, did Mahmoud Khalil really do something to actually imperil his visa? Like, sure, the executive should be able to take a visa. Sure, the president should be able to use military forces in case of an insurrection. But are those conditions precedent actually occurring? Answer, no. And now what do we do? Because our doctrine tells us we must defer to the executive branch. And that's, I think, the real legal challenge we're getting to, is we're going to have to kind of be like, gosh, we've seen this guy in court before, and actually that doesn't line up with reality. And I think that's kind of the more interesting legal question for us. But anyway, my 2 cents.
That's great. Thank you, Garri. I think we come up to this a lot in our programs about sort of the limits of law. I mean, there are, Kevin was talking about the difficulties or the worries that he has, and how many of those worries are made far graver by a lack of faith in the leadership that we have in critical positions. And you're talking about kind of the obligation of good faith stewardship, which might be lacking in the executive. It's tough stuff because it's hard to know what to do about it, and if courts can save us. Kevin, maybe I'll just do a quick round if you have any thoughts of some of the comments from Claire or Garri.
I agree with them all, and definitely the Constitution, when it was written, assumed a reasonable good faith actor in charge of the executive, and also, as Garri said, that it would be very difficult for Congress to respond quickly to a situation because they'd have to get into their horse and buggy, literally, and get to the Capitol to vote on it, and that's no longer the case. But I think the Insurrection Act has been invoked very, very many times throughout our country's history. Sometimes for bad reasons, to put down strikes, to put down slave rebellions, to push Indians back onto their reservations. It's been invoked in good circumstances to uphold federal court orders regarding desegregation. But I think that the two most recent examples, I think, are instructive about what the present day understanding of it should be. In 1992 in Los Angeles during the riots, LAPD, LA County Sheriff, California Highway Patrol, California National Guard couldn't handle it. So after a certain point, the governor said, we need 1st Marine Division and 7th Infantry Division from Fort Ord for help. And the president said yes. In 2005, Hurricane Katrina hits New Orleans, and pretty clearly, New Orleans PD and Louisiana State Police did not have control of the situation. My understanding is that the federal government reached out about declaring the Insurrection Act, and the governor of Louisiana didn't agree, and so that was held off, until the governor decided it was time to send the 82nd Airborne in. And I think there should be considerable deference to governors here as best understanding the situation on the ground.
Garri?
Yeah, no, and there was so much in the initial comments that I had not planned to address, but that I would love to take this opportunity to do that. And I think the number one is that social order is a construct, right? Like the social contract, law and order is something that occurs because we believe it does. We lack coercive force sufficient to repress the population of the United States. Right, so you very quickly, and the Guard has a big role in this, so it's kind of a tiered response. You quickly run out of Schlitz in the municipal police. The state police have a lot of assets, and they're designed to be mobile and like a cavalry unit. Actually, that's why they have troops and they wear the cap hats. They move to the problem, and so after that, the governor has the Guard and the kind of short, sharp shock of military-looking people showing up with military-grade weapons. And then after that, you have other federal forces that you can bring in. But social order is a construct that occurs because we all believe it does. There's no force sufficient in this country to force people to behave. All these tools are simply theatrical in a certain way. We can say, maybe employed in bad faith or in good faith for that theatrical effect. But usually it's to reassure the population that law and order has been restored and that the folks in New Orleans can resume their normal life after the hurricane, right? Like it's going to be okay. And that's kind of the good use of that tiered force. So again, the legal restrictions to prevent that from being used are not necessarily absolutely good things. It's the way in which they are used makes it either pernicious or not pernicious. And so, like elections have consequences, and we've kind of found ourselves where we are. But I don't know that the solution to that problem is a statutory one. It might be, as in the examples that Kevin talked about, with junior leaders refusing to upgrade their weapons posture. There's only with a reflective vest and no weapons and no riot gear, and I'm going to put myself in between the folks to keep them safe. Like there is a lot of tactics or techniques that we can use to deploy the military in a way that is not in opposition to the population, right? The army amongst the people should support them, just like our police and I do in my civilian job, right? The purpose of the police is to help encourage enforcement of our rights, not to take our rights away.
Thank you. And I'm going to start sprinkling in some audience questions in a minute. Claire, did you have anything that you wanted to respond to that you've heard or expand upon before I do that?
I'm sorry about that. Yeah. So I just wanted to respond to Garri's point about was not intended to restrict the federal government. That's not how. I mean, he's absolutely right that that's not how and why it was created. You know, that's not its original purpose. But that's very much consistent with the concept of civilian-military relations and the point and purpose of the whole principle of posse comitatus. What is the principle of posse comitatus? The principle is to ensure that our military is focused on military things and our law enforcement is focused on law enforcement things. And the critical distinction for making sure that constitutional rights are protected. So it's not just about making sure that 10th Amendment rights are protected. It's also about making sure that the constitutional rights of our citizens are protected so that those who are trained in policing the parameters of those rights can do the job that they're supposed to do. And if the federal government is a threat to those rights, it's absolutely appropriate that posse comitatus would be part of protecting against those usurpations.
Thanks. So actually, I wonder if either Garri or Kevin would speak to, we talk a lot, and we have talked a lot about sort of the potential dangers to citizens or to civil rights with militarized law enforcement or domestic deployment. As two gentlemen who have spent a long time in the military, what are the worries for the impact on our military, on whether recruitment, readiness, esprit de corps? Do you have any thoughts on that? Either of you? Who wants to go first?
Yeah, I mean, the military is about a third minority and about a fifth Hispanic. The Marine Corps especially is very heavily Hispanic. And if you have a situation where the federal military is being used as sort of a constabulatory force to detain and deport Hispanics and to arrest protesters, slash rioters from the political left, you're going to have, at least 50% of the country turn against the military. And, I was born in 72. I guess I got on active duty in 94. I always operated in an environment in which I had the overwhelming support of the American people, Republicans and Democrats alike. Even if they, didn't agree with the war in Iraq, there was no spitting upon me, when I came home. If the military becomes a partisan force and a highly racialized force, one, it's going to put the 1/3 of the troops who are minorities and the significant percentage, who knows, maybe 40% who are Democrats, in an awkward position. And it's going to put the institution in a terrible place related to the rest of the country. Every time the military has had to use force at home, it's redounded to the discredit of the military. It's made the military unpopular, whether that's Kent State in 1970, whether it's the dispersing the bonus marchers in 32, whether it's the Pullman strike back in the 1880s, I believe it was, and going all the way back, per a New York Times op-ed this morning, to the Boston Massacre in 1770. It always goes badly for the troops if force has to be used against civilians in this country.
I think I'd only add, folks, that, I don't need to tell anybody what our national motto is, right? E pluribus unum helps military esprit de corps and cohesion, just like the use of any government agency. The use of the military inconsistent with our principles degrades the support of the population for the military, just like it would for any other government agency. So, the trick is, and Army just came out with a great new leadership FM 1.0. The commitment to principles in the service is extraordinary. When I came as a liberal New York kid into the basic training 21 years ago, I was super impressed by the materials they gave about My Lai and about massacres and about the use of the law of war overseas. It's a remarkably principled organization. And so the closer it hews to those principles, the better and more effective a servant it is to the nation. And the farther we stray from those principles, the less effective it becomes.
Thank you. Some questions we have here. One, when the president federalizes the National Guard, is there any expiration on that federalization or nationalization? Can he keep that command indefinitely? Garri.
And again, I can answer the question. There's all sorts of rules and how this is done. But I think for our purposes, if the president needs the army to do things, there's a way for that to happen. That is legal. There's not the nation does not become impotent at some point that it cannot move its forces where they need to go to do the thing they need to do.
Another question we have from an audience member is a pretty direct and practical one. What can be done about a president who is intent on misusing the National Guard? Are there any meaningful checks? I think Garri maybe talked about a little bit in judicial deference to executive decision making, but
I can maybe try saying something about this if my connection holds. One of the important things that we haven't talked about is the fact that posse comitatus is a criminal statute. And it's important to remember that because thanks to the Supreme Court, there's now presidential immunity for official acts, and any troop deployment will be an official act. So it's important to remember that even if the president has immunity for posse comitatus violations, the Supreme Court was not at all clear about how far down the chain of command immunity would travel. And so once you get to the NORTHCOM commanders, all the way down the chain of command, they should not have immunity to posse comitatus violations. So as we said in an amicus brief that filed in the January 6th immunity case, that puts the chain of command in a very difficult position, because if they receive an illegal order from a president who has immunity, they're in a real hot place, because they can either choose to obey the order, which is the default. Of course, they should obey every order unless it's patently illegal. It'll very heavily with them that he has immunity with regard to a criminal statute. If they believe that the order is patently illegal, right? So the example, shooting protesters in the legs. I don't think we're going to see that, but if we did, right, in order to shoot protesters in the legs, what is he supposed to do with that? I hope that our senior military leaders would have the understanding to be able to say no. We're not going there. It's a violation in that case, not only of but a lot of other things. And do not, sir, have the immunity that you do. And we're not going to carry out that order. So I think a lot of it will depend on good order and discipline and an understanding of constitutional obligations in the military, and really hoping the integrity of our chain of command is going to hold.
Thank you, Claire.
I think ultimately the check on a president misusing his executive authority is supposed to be impeachment, conviction, and removal, and it's never happened in the history of our country. The founders didn't even assume that there'd be a standing army. So this is not something that they gave a lot of consideration to. The Second Amendment, as I read it, applies to the National Guard. So they assumed that that we wouldn't have parties. That you'd have some fairly aristocratic people in the House and the Senate, that senators would be appointed by state legislatures, and that if a president did something gross with any of his executive powers, that he'd be removed. The situation today is just very different, so it's a dangerous situation.
Actually, if I could jump in on that for a second, Greg, one of the things that's really interesting here is, and I did my university in the UK, is their constitutional experience. So, they have a unwritten constitution of norms, and so we as Americans in this very diverse background, we tend to parse the language and be like, hey, can I do this? Because the law or the Constitution is the only thing that unites us. But, so much of governing, and I think this goes to the themes that Claire was talking about, is based on what the expectations are. So, we may differ on what the restrictions of posse comitatus are and how often or when we've ever prosecuted someone criminally, answer never. But, the expectations that Claire enunciates are very real. Like, whatever the hard rule is, the norm in the United States is we use that tiering of forces: municipal police, state police, National Guard, federalized guard, active duty, last resort. And that's a very clear norm in the United States. And the fact that someone may have the authority to arrest someone or use lethal force or these things, we're all very clear what they should and shouldn't do based on our very, very important norms. And I think, again, one of the challenges we have with the current administration, if you look at the president before he was in public service, is a willingness to traverse norms or to contradict those expectations of what we all agree are the right principles that inform the use of the power we can use. But it becomes a should question, and our British cousins are very, very good about understanding these unwritten rules, and we tend to kind of do more of a Stephen Miller and say, well, I looked up this law and it seems like I can do this, so I'm going to do it. I'm going to try to withhold the transportation funds to allow to incentivize immigration enforcement, right? And I think our inner Britain would know how wrong that is on so many levels, but we have to wait for a court to come in and say, that's not quite cricket. It's not how you do this. I think that's the thing that, as a collective, we've been struggling to kind of elucidate, is there are principles here that are not just the black letter law, that are very, very, very important. And they go to the use of the military and how we look at our function and how we look at government.
Do you think that, Garri or anybody, that this is kind of a separate issue, but that the perceived increased militarization of local police departments with their tactical gear or dress has an impact in this conversation, and maybe just in how we think about norms? Or
that's a big topic. There's of course a program, the 10-333 program, in which local police departments can acquire used military equipment, and most of that is not pernicious. Most of that is backpacks and desks and pencils and whatever. But some of it could fit into highly teched up military equipment that police are not well trained to use. To me, this is mill issues as well, and why Possatus is such an important, despite its ignominious beginning, Garri pointed us to, such an important principle, because police need to do what they do best, and military need to do what they do best. And I don't think that police are going to be well trained and well equipped to handle very sophisticated AI-based military equipment. We have some instances of that, such as the robot that diffused a sniper in Texas years ago, and but mostly that stuff doesn't work out all that well. So I think the militarization of the police is a big concern, and everybody needs to understand this is sort of a public education campaign that we need to conduct, not only with members of the public, but with members of the military and with members of law enforcement. What the functions are between police and military, and how important it is to keep them separate for along a number of dimensions.
Thank you. I hope this. Go ahead, Kevin.
I don't like the creeping militarization of the police one bit, and I love cops. And I'll give you an example of it. I drove into D.C. during the George Floyd riots, and I saw a bunch of guys wearing sterile military uniforms and carrying heavy weapons. And the only people in the military that would wear sterile uniforms, would be maybe JSOC, like overseas. But I knew these guys weren't JSOC. It turned out they were Bureau of Prisons special response guys, without any, identifying marks on who they were. Like a regular cop has a badge number, right? If he hits you over the head with a club for the wrong reason, you can report him to internal affairs of the district attorney. I don't like one bit cops running around wearing battle dress uniforms as if they're in the military, any more than my many friends and family who are law enforcement would like me putting on an 8-pointed cap and a blue shirt and a star and, sort of looking and pretending like I was a cop when I'm not.
Well, we're coming up to the end of the hour. I hope this was a useful part of that public education campaign that we spoke about. I got maybe a half minute for each. If you have maybe a minute for each of you, if you have any closing thoughts, otherwise we can wrap up.
I'll just tap in on the police thing just because I do police oversight on my civilian side. And I think the challenge is that the officers hold themselves to a very high standard kind of military discipline, in their formal rules. But we don't expect them to exercise that amount of discipline and a lot more initiative when they are out policing the streets. So it kind of sends the wrong message the more we make them more tactical. And I think, in my brief experience in the field, you see more problems the more tactical they get and the less community-based they get. And you see fewer problems the more connected to the community they are and the less tactical they get.
I'm very worried for the. Go ahead, Professor. Sorry.
Please. Go ahead.
I'm very worried for the country and for the force. When I was an ROTC cadet at Johns Hopkins, we used to run through the ghetto, frankly, on our morning PT runs. And I remember the sergeant would greet every civilian we passed with a good morning, sir, or good morning, man. And I noticed he was even doing it to the homeless guys and stuff like that. And I sort of joked to him one time, like, why are you calling the homeless guy who's laying outside waiting for the liquor store to open, sir, when you're a master sergeant in the United States Army? And he goes, because I work for him too, and so do you, and don't ever forget it, cadet. And that really stuck with me. And I just hope we don't lose that.
I like that. So what I was going to say is I really believe in our military. I really believe in our especially our officer training. I spent a fair bit of time visiting at West Point, and the work that I do at the Center for Ethics and the Rule of Law it was inspired by the rule of law training that I saw at West Point and at some of the other military academies. I am very concerned about what the administration is doing with the JAG Corps and the firing of the JAG leaders. I think this next round of appointments, the person who's been nominated now for Army TJAG, we know has been the head of the National Guard Bureau. So I think that's probably not an accident. That's something to look at, to focus on. I hope that the Senate Armed Services Committee really does its job and looks carefully at those nominations. I think it's very, very important to keep that training on the rule of law in the officer corps as tight a ship as it's been over many years that our professional military has been going and having that kind of training. And I hope that that doesn't weaken in the military.
Well, thank you all. I mean, I really enjoyed this conversation. It left me with comfort and a good feeling about the quality and character of our military, but maybe all graver concerns about the potential for its misuse, and good things can be put to bad ends with disastrous results. So thank you all for this educating and enlightening conversation. I really appreciate it. We will be wrapping up now. I just want to remind all the folks watching live that we are a membership organization, and please consider joining us if you support our work. The link is there in the chat. This conversation was recorded and will be available to stream on YouTube and other platforms. You can follow our work and see announcements for coming events on YouTube, Twitter, Blue Sky, LinkedIn, and Facebook. Our next event is a live in-person cocktail mixer here in DC in a couple of weeks. Check that out. I'd love to see you there. Thank you all very much and have a wonderful rest of the day.